Hi, this is Tim of the 1916 Company. Welcome and thanks for logging on. Today we have a showdown between two turn-of-the-century rose gold Geneva-made tourbillon watches. Absolute top shelf. We've got the upstart modern independent FP Journe versus the oldest continuously operating Swiss watch manufacturer in Vacheron Constantin. Versus starts now. All right, so these two watches are similar in many ways, but worlds removed in terms of price and character. We're going to start with the Vacheron because if you're watching this channel, you're probably familiar with Journe. You've seen a lot on this channel. Let's talk about this watch right here. In the year 2000, Vacheron Constantin launched the Malt collection to propel the ancient manufacturer into the 21st century. This is the Malt Tourbillon, launched in the year 2000. This example right here sold in 2001. So the timepiece, of course, a tourbillon, but what makes it special is that it was one of the first ever Vacheron Constantin in-house developed movements. For most of its quarter millennium of existence, Vacheron was an établisseur, specifying the designs, assembling the parts from the best suppliers, and branding them under the Vacheron name. But gearing up to become a manufacturer in the 90s, Vacheron bought a company in the Vallée du Jeu called Manufacture Haute de Gamme. That company, in turn, contributed the movement caliber 1790 to this extraordinary complication by Vacheron, and the lack of a Geneva seal is not due to the finish, which is incredible, but due to the fact that this movement would have been built and executed in the Vallée du Jeu, which is outside of the city and canton of Geneva, a prerequisite for getting the Geneva seal. So do not despair. This is one of the finest finished watches you will ever encounter. It could easily have received the hallmark were the movement actually made in Geneva. Now, the watch is easy to wear, like the Journe. This watch hails from a late 1990s design sensibility. So 36 millimeters across the case, not including the crown, 12.3 millimeters thick, 47.9 from lug tip to lug tip, with a 19 millimeter spacing between the lugs. That said, any rectangular or square or tonneau shaped case is going to wear larger than its rated size. So this one feels more like a 40 millimeter round watch on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist. It's easily flat enough to fit underneath the cuff, but just keep in mind, if you're thinking 36, this was nothing like a 36 millimeter Ladies 24 from Patek or a 36 Datejust from Rolex. This is like a 40 round watch. As you can see, this came from one of our overseas offices, and when we ship watches around the world, we're mindful of CITES treaties, so don't get unnerved. Yeah, we've got fake alligator. You will get the real thing unless you want this lovely Jean Rousseau synthetic alligator leather strap. It's an interesting case. As you can see, Vacheron's tradition of flamboyant and memorable lug designs is upheld here. We've got a dial of extraordinary detail, and you can see that we have a lovely combination of a sunburst, and notice that the sunburst, it's actually exploding from an origin point, not under the hands, but an imaginary origin point over the tourbillon. Power reserve indicator, manual wind 40 hours. We have a little date, a radial style date, pusher adjuster for that. We have half brushed broadsword hands for better contrast against the dial base, rose gold indices, and then a lovely grooved guilloche reductively cut dial featuring the a priori marks, sometimes known as the sigma dial symbols. These were on Swiss watches from the 70s through very early 2000s to indicate the presence of real gold on the dial. They were encouraged by a Swiss precious metal trade organization. Technically, they're called the a priori marks. Vacheron was one of the last to persist with these, again, right up till about the year 2000. Now, the upper bridge of this tourbillon is tapered, mirrored, and continuously rounded, and it took 11 hours to finish by itself. We have a 1-minute tourbillon, a 2.5 hertz beat rate, an overcoil hairspring for isochronic operation in any position. And then you can see that the tourbillon cage itself is shaped like the Maltese cross, the logo of the company. We'll look in the hollows of each flank of the cross, and you can see that it's both externally and internally beveled inside those steel recesses. And the inner creases here are spectacular, those sharp inward bevels, the best you'll encounter anywhere. Turn it all over. Note the movement properly sized and shaped for the case. Vacheron, becoming a manufacturer, was able to design the movement and the case at the same time to fit in both size and form. The bevels here are hand-laid and hand-finished. You could see more interior creases, no shortage. Stripes unconventionally laid down down, light luminous and with a shading gradient, diagonally across the bridges, engine turning, you can see in several different sizes, a solarized barrel cap and a black or mirror polished ratchet wheel with mirror polished screw heads that include chamfered slots. It is the best of everything, even things like the reference number, the serial number, and the Vacheron Constantin name, freehand engraved with a burin onto this case back. So this watch, an extraordinary timepiece. Advantages? Well, many. This watch right here used $65,000 to $70,000. Compare that to $650,000 to $700,000 for the FP Journe, and you'll realize that this watch costs 1/10 as much money. I'll also say this comes from one of the most revered brands, a Holy Trinity brand, the oldest continuously operating Swiss watch brand. This watch is full of pedigree and long-standing reverence from collectors, the industry, vendors. Everyone has regard for a Vacheron Constantin, and this is a great one. I would also say that this is outstanding value because of the price, but also superior in finish. So both in terms of the price and in terms of substance, I'll leave the style up to you. This has it all over the FP Journe, which is not finished even remotely as well as this Vacheron. I also think, hey, more complication is better. And here we've got a date, a feature I actually do miss when it's absent. And it helps to improve the symmetry of the dial to have the power reserve counterbalanced. So if you hate dates because you don't like holes in dial, well, good news. The only hole in the dial here is the tourbillon itself. So that's what we've got going right here with the Malt tourbillon. Let's give the Journe a look. Now, this is a much newer brand. Francois Paul Journe made his first watch in 1983. He made his first wristwatch prototype, a prototype of this model, back in 1991, and he worked on it for the next 8 years before launching his first series production own brand or eponymously branded watches in 1999, and this was the debut model, Tourbillon Souverain, or as it's generally called, the Tourbillon Remontoire when we're talking about the pre-2004 versions. This was the first watch to use a remontoire d'égalité constant force device, the spring for which you can see on the back, and a tourbillon regulator. Now, Journe himself said the tourbillon is there for historical and aesthetic purposes. It's the overcoil hairspring, the free-sprung balance, the six-position adjustment, and the remontoire constant force device that are properly responsible for the precision of this watch. In rose gold, you can see that it is 38 millimeters in diameter, 9.4 millimeters thick, and if we go from lug to lug, then the total distance right here from lug to lug, it's only 44.8 millimeters as I measure it, with a 20 millimeter spacing in between the lugs. This is a very special watch, being what's known as a third series, so it doesn't have the 1 to 20 souscription numbering on the dial like the first series. It doesn't have the rounded remontoire cock like the second series, but it does have the big screws on the dial unlike the fourth series, and there are a couple of other traits on the reverse that mark it as a very early watch. This is one of the first 70 ever made. So it has a serial number under 70. You can see super shallow engraving on the reverse, characteristic of extremely early executions. You can also see that the case year of manufacture, 00, that is one of the very earliest when you consider that the very first watches were delivered in 99. You can also see that it is a French-made Eleanor case. There's the Eleanor maker's mark. We've got the French double eagle hallmark on this watch. So that is why there are French hallmarks and non-Journe maker's marks on this watch. Back then, Eleanor was Journe's longtime supplier, dating back to his pocket watch days. You can also see it is a brass movement. They didn't go over to gold until mid-2004, and I'm even going to say that if you're interested in how long the case numbering lasted, like how long did the case feature the stamping of the case's year of manufacture, that ended in about mid-2005. So it is a 40-hour to 42-hour manual wind power reserve, and like most Journe watches that are positioned on the market as chronometers or described as chronomètre, this watch features a power reserve indicator that moves backwards, indicating 0 when fully wound. And the idea there is like a marine chronometer, which needs to be wound exactly 24 hours from its last winding. It's more important to know how many hours since the last winding than it is to know how many hours till it stops. These watches are handmade in the best sense. Later on, Journe watches would be finished more precisely, but also more mechanically, whereas these early examples are obviously the product of a craftsman's art and hand. You could see a continuous rounding of the half bridge for the tourbillon, which has a bell-shaped filigree design that has historical inspirations, black polished and beveled tourbillon cock and remontoir cock. The dial made of solid gold, and you can see how these dials seem to age over time as the varnish that gives these early dials a sort of shiny shimmer. It ages in an irregular fashion, creating shading across the dial. Now, the remontoir ensures that for the first 28 hours, the 42 hours of power reserve, the same amount of force goes to the escapement, which allows for exceptional isochronous and consistent operation, including even balance amplitude that does not vary for 28 hours. So you just want to wind it at the same time every day. Advantages of this watch, well, this is the signature watch from the most consequential modern watchmaker, and that is almost beyond dispute. Very few watches have been more important, and no watch has been more important to F.B. Journe. F.B. Journe, in turn, has been the most influential person on the rise of independence in the modern watch market. So this is right at the crossroads of everything important about the independent brand movement and Journe himself. Almost the foundation watch of the entire independent brand movement. I would also say peerless innovation. The combination of the remontoir with the tourbillon really was a new one, and while there were other constant force wristwatch tourbillons, such as the Lange pour le Mérite tourbillon in 1994, this was a much more modern and compact and, frankly, more efficient execution with less parasitic drags on mainspring barrel energy than the Fusée Lange. It's also an easier watch to wear than the Vacheron, though this is a 38 and that's a 36. This is thinner. This is a round case. It wears like a 38 and it is a 38. So ergonomics. I would also say the investment value due to the significance of this watch, yes, it costs 10 times as much, but I can't see this gaining a ton of value. It'll be a solid store of value. This is like investing in fine art, and that's really beyond dispute. History and evidence is on the side of that claim. Rarity. These first 3 series are extraordinarily scarce, with really no more than a few dozen of any of the first 3 series of tourbillon remontoir. Whereas this was made in a few dozen a year for several years, there are likely more of these out there than there are Series 3 tourbillon remontoir. And I would also say this is potentially the better timekeeper. So if chronometry is important to you, Journe did design this watch with chronometry in mind in a wristwatch format. That's what the free-sprung 6-position overcoil remontoir combination gets you, whereas a tourbillon and a wristwatch can actually perform very, very well in a chronometry test that tests dial up, dial down, crown left, crown right, crown up, crown down. Actual wrist use is less predictable. So this is potentially the better timekeeper and possibly by a large margin. So which one would I choose? Well, I would say one of the big advantages, and this is really the last advantage I'm going to specify for the Vacheron, is that you don't meet your hero. Vacheron, Constantin, and most of the folks historically associated with the brand are long dead. Journe is very much alive, and he's a polarizing figure. You may find that you just don't operate on his wavelength. If you meet him, he might not be your buddy. He might come across as brusque. He might be more interested in people who are already close to him, who are present at any event where he deigns to present himself. Whereas with Vacheron, you don't have to worry about personalities getting in the way of your enjoyment of the watch. On the other hand, if you do click with Journe, then I can't imagine any cooler relationship with your watchmaker. So guys, just keep that in mind. On a value basis and a no-brand baggage basis, I prefer the Vacheron. On a finish basis, I prefer the Vacheron. For chronometry, innovation, fit, I prefer the Journe. Which one would I buy? If it's a cost issue, this. If I've got money, no object, I actually enjoy having this on my wrist more. So basically, I'm choosing the Vacheron, but that is highly cost-driven. Cost, no object, I probably pick the Journe. Guys, let me know in the description below, which of these two would you make yours?